So my name is Bjarte Bogsnes. I work for a Norwegian energy company called Equinor. We used to be called Statoil. We are Scandinavia's largest company. I'm also the chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, which is a network of organizations around the world that is of companies that are on a beyond budgeting journey in some form or shape. Why should companies go beyond budgeting, or why do companies have to go beyond budgeting? It is simply because the world has changed. Budgeting is a 100-year-old management technology, and the intentions back then was the very best to help organizations perform better. And I'm sure it worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. But today, things have changed radically. The world around us, our business environment, but also the quality and knowledge of people. If we are serious about knowledge organizations and knowledge workers, that also has implications for how we lead and manage. So beyond budgeting is a different way of managing, which challenges the assumptions behind traditional management, which basically is that people can and must be managed, and that the future is plannable and predictable. And well, we challenge both of those. The future is definitely not predictable. The only thing we know is that we don't know. And when it comes to people, of course you can manage people, but if you manage people in stupid ways, people find their way around. People are creative, people are smart. But that is not how we would like them to use their energy and creativity. So beyond budgeting is a set of principles, 6 on leadership and 6 on management processes. And this is important because it doesn't help. Of course we need to spell out what we believe when it comes to leadership and people and values. And most companies do in pretty nice words. But it doesn't help if those words, if they don't harmonize with the message in the management processes. And one example, it doesn't help to say that we think we have great people on board and we would be nothing without you and we trust you so much. Moving to management processes, of course we need detailed travel budgets. I mean, that is hypocrisy. It's kind of this lack of coherence between what we preach and what we practice. Now, some organizations find the 12 principles a bit overwhelming. There are simpler ways of getting started. And one way that we often recommend is to ask yourself a very simple question. Why does your organization make a budget? And in my experience, almost everybody asking themselves that question arrive at 3 different purposes. Companies use budgets to set targets, financial targets, sales targets, production targets, so that's one purpose. At the same time, companies use their budget numbers as a kind of forecast of what next year could look like in terms of cash flow, financial capacity. And the third purpose of budgeting is resource allocation, handing out bags of money to the organization on OPEX, CAPEX, cost and investments. And by all means, those are sensible purposes. The problem is that if you combine the 3 in one process resulting in one number, you get some serious problems. I mean, a classical example is if you ask the organization about the best revenue number for next year because you want to understand cash flow. Everybody knows that the revenue number I'm sending up will come back to me as a revenue or sales target for next year. Then we know what might happen with those numbers when there is a bonus linked to hitting those sales targets or numbers. Or if we ask people about their best cost or investment number for next year, but everybody remembers what happened last year when my numbers were cut with 30%. We know what happens when numbers sent upstairs. And this is a problem, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but it also stimulates what I will call almost unethical behavior. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the internal negotiations. That's not the kind of behavior we would like to see. Fortunately, there is a very simple solution. In Beyond Budgeting, we recommend to separate these three purposes into three different processes and allowing it to be different numbers, because these are different things. A target is what we want to happen. It's an aspiration. A forecast is what we think will happen. It's an expectation. And resource allocation is about optimizing scarce resources to get where we want to be towards targets. And by separating the three, we can improve each one in ways not possible when it's all bundled in one process and one number. So how can we set targets that really inspire and stretch people without feeling stretched? And targets that are much more robust against the volatility and uncertainty out there. How can we take the politics out of forecasting? So we have an unbiased forecasting process where we take away the reason for gaming the process. A forecast in our model is just a forecast. It is not a bid into target negotiation. It is not an application for resources. We have separate processes for that. And last but not least, how can we find more effective ways of managing cost than what a 100-year-old management technology can offer? And in Beyond Budgeting, we recommend, for instance, something called dynamic resource allocation. Try to make decisions about what to spend, not in a big batch once a year in the autumn in a budget. Try to make these decisions more continuous at the right time and at the right level, because then we have better information about what we shall say yes or no to, and our capacity, financial capacity to undertake it. So in many companies, including the one I work for, we have, for instance, like on investments, we don't have an annual investment budget, where we sit in the autumn the year before and decide everything. We are going to invest exactly this much, split exactly on these projects, and then we hand out these bags of money. Instead, we have a concept where we say that the bank is always open, in the sense that the business units can always forward a project for approval. Whether you get a yes or no depends on two things: how good is your project, and can we afford it as things look today. Is Beyond Budgeting relevant and needed also in Russia? And I don't think this is about national borders or different cultures. My experience, and I've been working all over the world, in Russia, in China, I'm just back from South Africa, and I find that the issues that business face are very much identical. We are all struggling with a future that the only thing we don't know is that we don't know. So that uncertainty is something that we have in common. And across the world, I mean, people are becoming more competent, more educated, more responsible. So this is not just a question or it's not a question of Russia learning from the West. It's about, I'm sure that there are, I mean, we can all learn from each other. And this is what Beyond Budgeting is about. We are trying to get together companies that are fascinated with this or on this journey, so that we can learn from each other. And these 12 Beyond Budgeting principles, 6 on leadership, 6 on management processes, they do not represent any kind of recipe of how this should be done. They are principles, and what this should mean in an organization depends on that organization's business, culture, history. So yes, maybe it could mean that this should mean somewhat differently for a certain Russian company compared to a certain South African company. But and actually some people get frustrated because these are principles. They don't give very specific guiding, but that's the way it should be. I don't like management recipes, because in a management recipe, somebody has done all the thinking for you. I mean, here, I mean, in Russia, you would need to reflect on and think about what could this mean for us, and how could this help us, just like companies are doing in other parts of the world. And even in China, there are amazing examples of what companies are doing. That is really mind-blowing and way ahead of what the so-called West is doing. So I don't think that kind of the intelligence here is kind of limited to a certain part of the world. The CFO role has definitely changed radically since I graduated from my business studies in the early 80s, and it has changed in a positive way. It has become a much broader role, a more strategic role, a more forward-looking role, and also a role where it's about more than the numbers. the best CFOs that I've observed are maybe even better with people and leadership than they are with numbers. And again, back to beyond budgeting, it is not a coincidence that we are talking not just about management processes, but also about leadership principles. And we always recommend that this is something that finance and HR together should work together on in organizations. And if there is an agile environment on the IT side, that can also be a very good kind of partner on this journey. This cuts across finance, HR. It is bigger than any individual function in an organization. And it is great news if you want to further broaden a finance role, a CFO role. That is what we've seen in Equinor. The finance role, the controller role is much bigger today, much more interesting, much more continuous, much more forward-looking, and much more non-financial than compared to what it used to be. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for being invited to this conference. When I look at the agenda, I definitely agree that the focus here is broader than only finance. I saw a big session later today on people and leadership, and that is the way it has to be. I think again, any function need to kind of climb out of its silo or own tower and start to think more broadly across functions and work better together with functions. And I think this is especially true for finance and HR. So I'm very happy to see that there are people issues addressed at this conference. I really enjoyed doing my session, and I really enjoyed the questions that I had afterwards. Very good questions, and I hope I was able to answer them in a sensible way.